My name is Amr Gharbeia. I come from Cairo, and I have been working in part of a social movement that has been active for the past couple of years, leading up to the revolution that took place in Egypt and is still taking place.
How do you see what really happened there in the Tahrir Square or in Egypt?
Tahrir Square has been the heart of a movement that has so far succeeded in removing the head of the Egyptian regime, Hosni Mubarak, and winning a few other wins. However, it wasn't the entire movement. 3 days before Mubarak's fall, there has been a huge wave of protests covering all over Egypt, putting the country to a complete halt. And I think this is the threat that has convinced the military council, the army, to take sides, change sides, and decide to oust Mubarak to avoid a much more radical change. I can trace the roots of this movement to two strands of activism over the past 10 years. The first of them is the movement for democratic and civic rights that has been active starting in the year 2000 in a small committee that has been supporting the Palestinian Intifada. It was obviously easy to see an enemy that's outside Egypt, Israel and the United States, supporting the aggression on Gaza, and following that core group has moved on in the year 2003 to, for the first time, saw the movement from within when Mubarak was actively supporting the invasion of Iraq by the Anglo-American troops. By 2004, 2005, there was a democratic opening due to external pressures from the United States to force democracy on the region, and activists within that same movement have started formulating an agenda, a program for what Egypt would be like, and he used those years around the first presidential elections to take place. Not, of course, free elections, but what seemed more like voting and choosing among several candidates to start a wave of street protests calling for the removing of Mubarak, his police state. The country has effectively been ruled under a military regime, and the states of security giving the police almost actually powers that are not restricted at all. Torture has been prevalent, and elections have been rigged all the time, and the judiciary is not independent. So we have been active at that time, and the internet and a new generation of activists who have used the internet to organize in a more free space and touch later on the streets of Cairo. So somehow those activists had one foot in cyberspace and one foot in the streets.
Okay, so on the 25th of January, when the revolution started, we know that people were invited through Facebook and through internet to take part in revolution in Tahrir Square. What do you think? At that time, did you go there to make a revolution?
I could see that there was going to be a big protest, so not only the couple of hundred or couple of thousand people who are used to going to protests downtown Cairo. So obviously this one was going to be big. And I didn't realize it was a revolution at the time, on the 25th of January, because even though we were tens of thousands of people and we were occupying the square, by midnight we were tear gassed and rubber bulleted out of Tahrir Square and chased to dawn. And there has been skirmishes the following 2 days in several cities, including in Cairo, but particularly in Suez, where people were killed. And it wasn't until the following Friday, the 28th, when I realized that this is going to be really big. This is the biggest thing I have seen in my life, because 8 million people have poured onto the streets of Cairo after Friday prayer. So between noontime and 6 p.m. there was virtually a war in all the big cities and towns, and the police, riot police army, it is an army of 1 million people, larger than the real army, has been completely destroyed. And this was the main tool of oppression that has been used against the people for so long. That was when I realized this is going to be a revolution. Parallel to that track I told you about of the group of people that's organizing around democratic reform, there has been a much larger movement taking almost the same 10-year journey, but particularly visible since 2008. That's a movement for social justice, the right to organize in labor movement, in labor unions, and demanding a dignified life. Basically, 40% of the Egyptian population live under $2 a day, which is the UN poverty of line. So that movement asking for a decent living wage used the slogan, we want to reach the poverty line. That was their goal, £1,200 a month minimum wage. And all the social injustices that we see all around Egypt has caused a wave of industrial action, strikes, and road blockages that have been increasing. So from few hundred, 1 or 200 back in 2007, 2008, up to 500 the year preceding the revolution. After the revolution only, and within 10 days, we have seen another 500. So the movement is accelerating, it's really on the rise, and this is the real force that has, in my mind, caused the real pressure to and caused the revolution.
And what will be the most probable outcomes in the near future?
We could end up again ruled by a military regime like the one we are just trying to get ourselves from, and this is the current situation unless there is a massive movement to push the army to challenge the absolute authority of the army that's effectively ruling the country in a coup now. Another possibility is that if there is a democratic process taking place, now the general elections have been announced to come in September, the presidential elections of 2 months later in November, and within those months a lot of parties that have been kept from being active are trying to organize, although in very difficult conditions. It seems to me most likely now that the most powerful powers in the street are the same old businessmen and the socially conservative, the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. And it seems that unless a lot of organization is taking place by other powers like the liberals, like the social democrats, like a party that represents the working class, the new government would look very close to the old one, forming through a coalition of those who have a lot of money and those who are socially conservative. A third possibility would be that the street movement, the wave of protest, would lead to a more radical change, but that depends really on how much we stay in the streets. One of the main demands of the revolution was to end torture. The police force has been effectively using torture as a means of investigation, of interrogation, and also has been used to control political activity. Now the police has been crushed, the military police has stepped in and practiced that role, so torture still continues, particularly to activists, people who have been taking part in the revolution. So let's say the journalist who has been active for 6 years at least, the singer who has been in Tahrir Square keeping us awake all night and singing, and so those are people I have known personally who have been labeled thugs and referred to military tribunals that the least you can say about is that they are unfair and have been subject to torture. It is estimated that at least 1,000 people have been referred to those military tribunals, while the heads of the former regime are either still free or going through a normal, more fair judicial process. A small, again, this is where initiative proves itself useful. A small number of people have been pushing the message that the army is not going to save the revolution. The army is trying to overtake the revolution, and this message has been has faced resistance. But with the insistence of those few people, the general sentiment now is that yes, there are violations. Yes, the army needs to be kept in check. Last Friday, the 1st of April, there were about 250,000 in the street again, telling the army the reforms are not happening deep enough or quickly enough, and we need to see those people from the old regime being put on trial. We need to see an end to torture, and we need to see a clear path for the interim period. Friday following, the April 8th, there should be another protest actually to put more pressure. So I'm glad that pressure is coming back to the street. People are realizing that they need to build their own powers and organize in political parties and NGOs and in syndicates and labor unions, but also they need to keep the general street pressure to push the entire democratic environment towards being realized.
What would be the message from social or human rights activist from the Tahrir Square, Cairo, to the people of Finland?
Here in Finland, talking to people, I'm beginning to realize that this has a relation. This actually, people are identifying in Finland with all that has been going on in Egypt, and I think that the only way to guarantee and extend democracy and freedom and justice further south than the Mediterranean is to work in a sort of a global movement. But it seems to me, from what I've realized, is that the best way to support a revolution there is to have your own revolution here. It could look very different. It could be something completely in a different track. It could include a lot of ideas around sustainability, around green economy, around social justice and global trade, and we could use a world that is much more peaceful. And these are, I think, the main issues that Finnish people can contribute to the rest of our worldwide movement.
Thank you, Amr, and good trip back home.
Thanks a lot. I'm glad to be here.